Hey guys, tonight we step into a world built without blueprints, and yet, somehow, it still stands. This isn't a story about technology or tools. It's about patience. About stone and timber shaped by hands that knew the land better than any machine ever could. What happens when people build not for profit, but for permanence? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It's quietly powerful to see how far these quiet, forgotten legacies still echo. If you find peace in these slow, deep corners of history, feel free to subscribe. You're always welcome here. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise. And let's begin. Yuri standing in a fog-damp field beside an unfinished wall. There are no machines. No nails. No plans. Just stone. And silence. And the memory of how to build. There were no blueprints in the world you're about to enter. No concrete mixers rumbling in the distance. No power tools slicing through timber. The clamor of modern construction, with its scaffolding and hard hats, belonged to a future that had not yet been imagined. In this earlier world, 1,000 years in the past, buildings rose not with speed, but with patience. Not by the calculations of engineers, but by the hands of men and women who knew the earth by feel and the sky by scent. Every structure was a negotiation with nature. And somehow, many of those buildings are still standing. Tonight you are not walking through a castle. Not yet. You are walking along the edge of a field, where stones have been placed in strange, silent harmony. The wall beside you does not seem tall, nor strong. It is made of stone, but not held together by anything visible. No mortar, no glue, no hidden rebar. Just rocks, balanced on rocks, some barely larger than a loaf of bread. And yet, this wall has stood here for nearly 1,000 years. The sheep still graze behind it. The wind still brushes against it. And the wall endures, as though it were a natural part of the earth itself. You might think this wall is simple. But it is not. It is the quiet brilliance of the forgotten. The wall was not stacked in a day. It was built by someone who read each stone like a sentence. Who knew the weight and grain of granite as well as a scribe knows ink. Each stone was chosen not just for its size, but for its role. A lock here, a wedge there, a gap left open so that rain would pass through, not destroy. These were not accidents. They were choices. Centuries before architects gave names to such designs, they were being perfected by barefoot laborers who never learned to write, but who knew how to build what would last. Further on, your path leads to a home. At first, it seems small, a low-roof structure tucked into the curve of the land, half hidden by the gentle rise of a hill. You do not yet know that this is intentional. The builders chose this spot not because it was empty, but because it was wise. The earth itself would shelter the home. The cold would not bite so deeply in winter. The heat would not suffocate in summer. The land was not a problem to overcome. It was a partner. Step inside. Duck beneath the wooden lintel, worn smooth by generations of palms and foreheads. The air is cool, not because of magic, but because of layers, earth and thatch and timber, arranged in quiet concert. There is no electric hum here. No hum of a radiator, no whir of a fan. And yet the space breathes. It holds warmth in its bones, releases it slowly through the night. It is not passive. It is alive. Look upward. The roof above you does not shine or glimmer. It is thick and golden, woven from reeds and grasses, 2 feet deep. At a glance, it seems rustic. But it is a marvel. Each stalk was chosen. Each bundle placed with the direction of the wind in mind. Water does not seep in. Snow slides off. And beneath, the sound of rain is softened into lullabies. The roof bends. It breathes. It lasts 50 years or more. All of it built without nails. Only patience. Only hands. In the far wall, a soft glow filters through something unexpected. Not glass. Not even parchment. But a thin, stretched membrane, the dried bladder of an animal, cleaned and waxed and carefully framed. It seems crude. Until you remember, it lets in light, holds out the wind, and costs nothing but care. And through it, the room is not dark. It is not bright either. It is gentle, shadowed, kind. The walls are not made of brick, not carved from whole stone. They are woven, literally. Thin branches, bent and tucked, forming a lattice like the frame of a basket. And over that, a coat of earth and straw and something else, something we no longer speak of in polite company. Dung. Yes. But not in shame. Because the builders knew what it could do. Dung mixed properly, strengthened the walls, filled the gaps, and dried to a hardness that outlasted storms. The odor faded. The strength remained. Now imagine the floor beneath your feet. It is not tiled, nor polished. It is earth. But not just any earth. It is compressed, sealed, and treated with oils or even blood to make it hard, resilient, and waterproof. You do not slip. You do not freeze. And if a crack forms, it can be fixed with a shovel and a handful of ash. No repairman needed. And what of the frame? The very bones of this house. They are wood, but not random planks. Each beam is joined by skill, not force. Mortise and tenon joints, like puzzle pieces, locked without metal. Pegs made of oak carved slightly larger than their holes, so they swell with moisture and never loosen. These joints allow the house to move, to sway with storms, to settle without shattering. It is not stiff. It is supple. Above your head, there is no chimney, only a hole in the roof. Smoke curls upward from the central hearth, staining the beams but also preserving them. Insects flee from the scent. Moisture does not rot what smoke has cured. The hearth warms the entire room, evenly. It is not convenient, but it works. It works in a way modern systems often forget, in harmony with the space. The more you look, the more you realize, nothing here is careless. Every line is deliberate. Every imperfection is a negotiation. This house is not fighting nature. It is listening to it, learning from it, letting it in, and keeping it out, at the same time. The people who built these places did not read manuals. They read clouds. They watched how moss grew on stones, how frost settled in hollows. They did not argue over insulation ratings. They touched the walls and knew. They passed their knowledge not through paper, but through apprenticeship. A father showing a son. A woman passing skills to her daughter. A neighbor lending hands, then being repaid in bread or song. There is something deeply humbling about these spaces. They do not shout. They do not try to impress. They endure. Not because they are indestructible, but because they know how to bend, how to breathe, how to be mended. Their builders did not seek perfection. They sought balance. And that balance is what has lasted. Tonight you sleep in such a place. The walls do not buzz. The lights do not flicker. But the wind outside is met with quiet strength. And in the silence, you begin to feel something rare, a kind of trust in the room around you. Not just safety, but understanding. You are not a visitor here. You are part of it. This was only the beginning. The techniques you've just seen, the walls, the roofs, the windows, were not isolated tricks. They were part of a larger philosophy. A way of living that respected material, space, and time. In the chapters ahead, we will follow this wisdom as it unfolds in barns and cellars, churches and bridges, in fire and in frost. But for now, let the quiet of this first home settle around you. And as the fire crackles, and the wind taps softly at the thatch above, remember. This place still stands. And its survival is not a miracle. It is memory. Built into stone. Held in wood. Passed on, one hand at a time. In the stillness of early morning, before the dew has yet begun to steam from the grasses, you hear the slow creak of wood shifting, not in collapse, not in failure, but in adjustment. As if the building around you has risen from sleep and is now stretching its limbs, testing its weight, settling gently into the rhythms of the day. This isn't a house built with bolts or nails. What holds this place together is older, softer, and more alive. It is wood. But more than that, it is the breath of timber, the give and pull of carefully seasoned trees, fitted together not with brute force but with intimate understanding. If you were to step outside and look at the frame of this building, what you'd see might seem deceptively simple. Thick beams, some the width of a man's torso, stretch up at slight angles. Cross pieces fit perfectly into vertical posts. But there is no iron here. No screws, no drills, no hidden brackets. The joints are wooden too, pegged together using dried oak dowels, cut by hand and driven through mortise and tenon joints. These pegs are slightly larger than the holes they are pressed into. And as the seasons shift, as dampness swells the wood, the pegs lock tighter, not looser. Time makes the building stronger, not weaker. This is not an accident. It is the result of patience, of knowledge passed mouth to ear, generation to generation. The timber used here was not cut and used in the same week. It was felled in winter, when the sap runs low. It was seasoned for years, left to dry in a protected place, allowed to breathe and shrink naturally before it would ever be trusted to carry the weight of a home. Greenwood warps. Builders knew this. They waited. They respected the mood of the tree before asking it to become something else. Imagine the work. Each beam must be carved with intention. Each notch must be measured by eye, tested by hand, and aligned not just for the present but for the future, when the beam would flex under snow, when it would creak in summer heat, when it would carry generations of footsteps. And these builders didn't just build alone. When the time came to raise the frame, the entire village would gather. This was not a job for one man. It was a celebration, a barn raising, a house lifting. Ale was shared. Songs were sung. Children watched as wood, once rooted in the earth, rose into the shape of shelter. The heart of this structure is its flexibility. Modern buildings pride themselves on rigidity, on being straight, unyielding, machine-perfect. But the medieval frame was a dancer, not a statue. These buildings were designed to move with the earth. When storms blew, they bent. When frost heaved the ground, they swayed and returned. The joints didn't crack, they shifted. And in that shifting, they survived. Each piece of timber had its own personality. The builders knew this. One beam might be straighter, another stronger. A third might curve in just the right way to support a lintel or brace a roof corner. They didn't waste time forcing the wood to become uniform. Instead, they worked with what the tree had given them. If it bowed slightly, they found a place where that bow would carry weight more efficiently. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was ignored. And if you look closely, you'll see marks, not just tool cuts, but symbols. Builders carved signs into beams to mark placement, orientation, or simply to track their own work. These weren't random scratches. They were the quiet fingerprints of those who built with care. Some are still visible today, faint etchings left behind by hands that never imagined their work would still be standing centuries later. The timber frame is not just the bones of the house. It is its language. The way light falls through angled rafters. The rhythm of posts spaced evenly along a wall. The sense of balance and proportion that guides your eye even before you realize what you're seeing. The geometry of these homes was not taught in classrooms. It was felt in the body, in the way your back bends to lift a beam, in the way your palm fits the edge of a chisel. Even the placement of the frame within the land was considered. Builders didn't just drop homes wherever there was space. They paid attention to wind, to drainage, to the sun's slow arc across the seasons. A house turned too far to the north might stay damp all winter. One built too low in the land might flood with spring rains. But placed carefully, angled gently, the timber frame could breathe. It could dry itself. It could stay warm with less wood, stay cool with less air. This was efficiency, born not of equations but of centuries of accumulated observation. Inside the timber frame, space was sacred. Rooms weren't large, but they were purposeful. Upper floors were often tucked beneath steeply angled roofs, framed in with the same precision as the walls below. These lofts slept entire families. The curve of the roof didn't waste space, it sheltered it. The heavy crossbeams held not just the roof, but sometimes entire stores of grain or hanging herbs, woven between the wooden ribs of the house. You might expect a home built from wood to feel fragile. But it does not. It feels alive. The scent of timber lingers long after the sawdust has gone. It rises in the warmth of the hearth and settles in the cool corners of the day. On rainy evenings, you can hear the soft tapping of water against the outer beams. On frosty mornings, the creak of a stretching rafter is like an old friend shifting in bed. And when repairs were needed, as they always were, the knowledge was nearby. Not in a manual, not in a warehouse, but in the memory of the carpenter, the neighbor, the apprentice. A rotted joint could be replaced. A sagging beam lifted with wedges and shored with new pegs. These homes weren't abandoned at the first crack. They were healed, tended like gardens, lived in like relationships. To own a timber frame house was not to possess a structure, but to enter into a long-term companionship with it. Even fire, the great enemy of wood, was respected, not feared. Hearths were built in central places, surrounded by stone. Smoke was vented carefully, but not always through a chimney. Some homes allowed smoke to rise slowly through thatch or tiled vents, curing the wood as it passed. The beams, blackened but strong, bore the marks of years of fire, not destruction, but preservation. The smoke hardened them, protected them. A paradox only understood by those who lived close to the rhythm of flame and fiber. Some frames were built not as homes but as barns, mills, granaries, and churches. But the principles remained the same. Mortise and tenon. Oak and ash. Pegs that tightened over time. And in each of these buildings, the timber frame was more than a support. It was a memory system. A visible record of time. Of growth rings and tool marks. Of smoke stains and children's names scratched in soft pine. And when one of these buildings grew too old or too worn to stay standing, it was not always torn down. Sometimes it was taken apart, frame by frame, joint by joint, and moved. Timber frames were modular before the word existed. A house in one village might be rebuilt in another, its beams reassembled like a puzzle with familiar pieces. The building lived on. Not in ashes, but in rebirth. There is a humility to this kind of building. A willingness to be temporary yet last. A trust that if you do your part, season the wood, measure the joints, honor the tree, the building will do its part too. It will protect. It will shelter. It will survive. So tonight, as you rest inside this wooden frame, warmed by a hearth, shielded by a thatched roof, surrounded by beams that have heard generations of voices, know this: you are not in a fragile place. You are in a place that was meant to endure. Not by standing still, but by learning how to move with time. This is what the old builders knew. That the strongest homes are not the ones that fight the world, but the ones that listen to it. That the soft creak of timber is not a warning, it is a welcome. That a house, like a story, is only alive when it is shared. And you are part of that story now. There is something ancient and comforting in the sound of rain falling on a thatched roof. Not the sharp tap of metal or the echo off tile, but the muffled, whispering hush as each droplet vanishes into tightly packed reeds. You lie beneath this roof now, eyes open in the dark, and the rain sounds not like weather but like memory, as if the house is remembering every storm it has ever sheltered someone from. The roof above you isn't just a covering. It is a woven shield. It is warmth. It is life. And it was built not from modern invention but from grass. To the modern eye, a thatched roof seems quaint, the stuff of fairy tales and folk art. But to those who built them, these thick, sloped structures were masterpieces of insulation and survival. Crafted from local straw, water reed, heather, or even rushes, these roofs weren't thrown together. They were layered, pressed, and bound with the expertise of a seasoned thatcher, often someone who had trained for a decade to learn the craft passed down through generations. There was precision here. The angle of each bundle. The pressure of each binding. The direction of every stalk. Nothing was accidental. A good thatched roof wasn't just dry. It was warm in winter and cool in summer. At over 2 feet thick in some cases, these natural coverings held in the heat from your fire, the breath of your family, and the gentle rising warmth of the earth. In the colder months, they kept the night wind at bay. In the heat of summer, they released that stored warmth slowly, allowing the air beneath to remain calm and temperate. It was natural climate control before the idea even had a name. The shape of the roof mattered. Steeply pitched, often at angles between 45 and 60 degrees, these rooftops were designed not just to keep water out, but to cast it off, to send it rushing away in sheets before it could soak in. Each layer of thatch overlapped the one below it, like the scales of a fish or the feathers of a bird. Rain slid down in silence. Even in the fiercest storm, the inside of the home remained untouched. But rain was only part of the battle. Cold and rot were the others. To that end, medieval builders took their time. Thatching straw was often harvested a year before use and left to dry slowly in barns or under shelters, protected from rot and mold. Fresh straw would bend and twist, warp under pressure. Aged straw was stable. It laid flat, cooperated, held its shape under tension. Builders understood this not from manuals, but from watching, from growing up in homes where the roof itself told stories. Fire, of course, was a danger. But even here, thatch was more resilient than many assume. Tightly packed thatch is slow to ignite. A roof that is properly cared for, cleaned, treated, brushed, resists flames better than a dry wooden shingle or neglected slate. Some builders coated the outer layers in lime wash or clay, giving them a breathable skin that repelled both sparks and pests. Beneath the roof, the shape of the building responded to the needs of insulation. Ceilings were low. Beams were thick. Space was intimate, not out of poverty, but out of wisdom. Warmth rises. A high vaulted ceiling wastes it. A snug loft beneath the eaves traps it, holds it close, shares it among those who sleep in blankets stitched from old cloaks and leftover wool. The loft was often the warmest place in the home. Children slept there, tucked between hay-stuffed mattresses and walls of stacked herbs. Dried lavender and rosemary hung from the beams, their scent released slowly by the warm breath of the hearth below. Sometimes, the thatch itself carried smells, of field and smoke, of sun-warmed grain in distant summer. The materials used in thatching weren't random. Water reed, for instance, could last 50 years or more with proper maintenance. Heather roofs, more common in Scotland, were thicker, heavier, and nearly impenetrable to wind. Builders chose materials not based on fashion, but on the rhythms of the land. What grew nearby? What bent in the wind? What stayed strong when soaked? Every answer led to a different roof, a different shelter shaped by local truths. And the roof did more than cover. It held things. Hooks suspended baskets of dried meat or bundles of herbs. Gaps between rafters were stuffed with fleece or rags to prevent drafts. Birds nested in the outer thatch. Spiders wove their webs beneath the overhangs. The roof was a home not just to people, but to small lives that, in turn, helped protect the house, catching flies, frightening off rodents, sounding warnings with sudden motion. In grander homes, roofs became more ornate. Carved beams supported tiles or wood shingles, each laid with precision. But even here, the knowledge of insulation was never forgotten. Roofs were vented not with mechanical systems, but with narrow slits placed high under the eaves. Warm air rose naturally. Smoke followed it. The house breathed without fans. It lived. Roofs were maintained with ceremony. Every few years, a section might be replaced, not all at once, but gently as needed. Thatchers climbed barefoot, their toes gripping the curves of the bundles like dancers on a tightrope. They worked in silence, listening to the whisper of straw beneath their hands, feeling for rot, for softness, for change. Repair was not a disruption. It was a continuation, a nod to the passage of time, a reminder that nothing is truly finished, only maintained. Some roofs bore signs. Charms, talismans, bones. Woven into the ridge or tied beneath the eaves, they were meant to guard against lightning, evil spirits, illness. Whether they worked or not was less important than the comfort they offered, the sense that the roof above you saw not just rain and snow, but misfortune, and could keep it out. In monasteries and barns, the roofs became cathedrals in their own right. Vast wooden arches spanned halls large enough to echo. Here, the timber beams were feats of geometry, lattices of crisscrossing triangles, each brace holding the next, distributing weight with the grace of a spider's web. These were not just functional. They were beautiful. They reminded those beneath them that structure could also be soul. And yet, even the grandest roof was judged not by its height, but by its silence. The best thatch did not rustle in the wind. The best tiles did not rattle in storms. A good roof was known by the stillness it offered, the way it let you forget it was even there, because nothing beneath it ever felt exposed. Tonight, as you drift deeper into the quiet warmth of this ancient shelter, let your eyes follow the slope of the ceiling. Imagine the hands that laid each bundle of straw, the farmer who grew it, the thatcher who shaped it, the family who danced in its shadow on the day it was raised. They are all still here, in the warmth, in the hush, in the gentle weight of the roof above you. And in that stillness, the past does not feel so far away. You are standing now, barefoot, in the center of a dimly lit medieval home. The fire has gone low, and only a faint amber glow dances across the walls. But beneath your feet, there is no creaking plank, no cold ceramic tile. Just packed earth, smooth, solid, and silent. It feels ancient. It feels permanent. As if it remembers every footstep that has ever crossed it, every season it has endured, every whisper of wind that passed beneath the door. This is no random patch of dirt. Medieval floors were crafted with patience, ritual, and understanding. Layer upon layer of earth, ash, lime, clay, and sometimes even blood, not spilled, but brushed in, used as a sealant. These floors did not crack easily, did not splinter, and did not shift with every footfall. They were, quite literally, built into the land. And they were alive with memory. To create such a surface, builders began with excavation. A shallow trench, just deep enough to remove the soft upper layers of soil, revealed the stable earth beneath. Then came the layering. Crushed stone or rubble, compacted tightly, formed a drainage base. Over that, finer soil or clay was pressed down by hand and by foot, not once, but repeatedly. They stomped. They danced. They rolled heavy stones across it like dough. Each pass brought the surface closer to hardness. Sometimes straw was mixed into the soil for added fiber and flexibility. Other times, wood ash was stirred in, not only for texture, but for sanitation. Ash acted as a mild disinfectant, and in a world where sickness often traveled unseen, even small measures mattered. In colder climates, floors were coated with a thin layer of lime or oil, both of which hardened and helped shed moisture. Linseed oil, when applied and left to cure, created a subtle sheen, almost like stone. Animal blood, rich in proteins, was sometimes painted across the floor and left to dry. It sounds macabre, but it sealed the surface, filled the pores, and bound the particles together. The result was a floor that resisted wear for decades. But beneath this polished surface, deeper secrets were hidden. Medieval builders understood foundations in a way that feels intuitive and mysterious all at once. There were no blueprints. No structural engineers with formulas and calculators. Only knowledge passed from hand to hand, from father to son, from master mason to apprentice. And yet, the walls they built still stand. Foundations began not with cement, but with observation. Where did the rainwater gather after a storm? Where did frost linger in the morning? What did the soil feel like between the fingers? If the earth was soft, builders dug deeper. If it was rocky, they adapted. They didn't fight the land, they listened to it. A trench would be cut, not perfectly straight, but following the contours of the land. Into this trench went rubble, large stones first, to allow for drainage, then smaller ones to fill the gaps. These were not laid flat like bricks. They were tossed, rotated, nudged into place until they formed a bed that shifted only slightly, breathing with the seasons but never breaking. No mortar held these stones together. And that was the secret. Mortar freezes. Mortar cracks. But stones, if chosen well and placed with care, interlock like puzzle pieces. They move with the earth, flexing and settling with the rhythms of time. The first courses of a wall sat on this rubble foundation like a crown on a brow. Heavy oak beams, if used, were set on flat stones to keep them above ground moisture. And as the walls rose, they remembered their roots, always grounded, always mindful of the foundation below. In some places, floors were elevated, laid atop wooden beams spanning from one foundation wall to the other. These suspended floors offered insulation from cold ground, protection from rodents, and space for storage or airflow beneath. But even these wooden structures began with stone and earth, always returning to the land for stability. Medieval cellars went even deeper. Carved from the earth, lined with stone, and arched with brick, these cool, dark spaces served as pantries, workshops, and sanctuaries. Their vaulted ceilings, curved like the inside of a cupped hand, distributed weight perfectly. No central columns were needed. Just gravity, pressure, and the elegance of the arch. To walk into a medieval cellar was to step into a time machine. The air changed. The sound shifted. Walls pressed close with the comfort of stone. And here, beneath the surface, everything was preserved, not just wine and salted meat, but a sense of stillness, of protection, of waiting. Even outside the home, builders shaped the land itself to support their structures. Berms of packed earth reinforced walls. Drainage ditches circled the perimeter like protective moats. Water, always the enemy of stone and timber, was guided, channeled, honored. Not with pipes, but with gravity and care. Doorways and thresholds were another marvel. The shape of an entrance could determine the warmth of a room. Wider at the base, narrower at the top, medieval doorways created natural funnels for airflow. They minimized drafts, directed smoke, and reinforced the surrounding structure. Each threshold was more than a step, it was a seal, a gate, a transition between worlds. Some thresholds were fitted with stone blocks worn smooth by generations of feet. Others used thick wooden planks soaked in oil and scored with iron nails to grip boot soles in winter. You could tell the age of a house by its threshold. How deep the dip, how rounded the corners, how many steps it had seen. Foundations were not hidden in the medieval world, they were revered. On feast days or during major repairs, offerings were sometimes left at the base of walls, coins, carved charms, tiny figurines. Some builders believed these tokens protected the house. Others thought they honored the spirits of the land. Either way, the act acknowledged something sacred in the stone beneath us. Even the cracks told stories. A hairline fissure might trace the path of frost over a hard winter. A dip in the floor might mark the place where a grandfather once sat every morning. In these subtle deformations, time carved its signature. In larger buildings, monasteries, manor houses, guild halls, the principles of flooring and foundations were the same, only grander. Flagstones replaced earth. Piers of carved limestone sank deeper into the soil. But still, the builders watched the rain, touched the soil, and chose every stone by hand. They knew that a home, a hall, a sanctuary, all began not with walls, but with the ground. And they treated that ground with respect. So tonight, as you rest and feel the imagined weight of earth beneath your spine, think of those hands that tamped the soil, that placed each stone, that paused to feel the earth's answer before continuing. This floor you sleep on, whether in memory or in dream, has held 1,000 others. And in that holding, it has become something more than just dirt. It has become foundation. In the medieval world, a doorway was never just a doorway. It was a threshold between realms. A narrow crossing from warmth to cold, from private to public, from the fragile human interior to the unpredictable world beyond. Long before locks and security systems, the design of a door itself carried meaning and function. A door had to keep out the wind, the wolves, and the wrong kind of eyes, yet it also had to let the world in, sometimes in sudden urgency. The cry of a neighbor, the scent of bread, the arrival of the priest. The choices made by medieval builders in shaping doors were not merely practical. They were emotional. A door shaped how a home breathed. Step closer to one now, if only in your mind. Perhaps it's oak, dark, heavy, grooved from years of weather and hands. Its top is arched, bowed slightly like a nodding head. Maybe iron studs dot its face, not for decoration alone but to brace against warping. The hinges are thick, hammered by a local blacksmith who knew that a sagging door meant more than poor construction. It meant cold creeping in, warmth slipping away, animals intruding, children crying in the night. Doors bore weight, yes, but they also bore memory. Some were so old that each creak held decades of secrets. Builders rarely made doors identical. The poor might use split timber, unevenly shaved, the gaps stuffed with moss or straw. The wealthy commissioned panels of seasoned wood, bound with iron straps and fitted snugly into carved stone frames. In both cases, the goal was similar: protect what mattered. But in doing so, builders revealed the household's position in the world. A wide, double-hinged door announced status. A narrow plank with a pull rope whispered survival. And there was symbolism. Arched doors were not chosen only for their strength. They mimicked church vaults, heavenly shapes that offered subtle spiritual reminders as one entered or left a space. In villages where few could read, the shape of a door taught theology. Rectangular entries spoke of duty and plain living. Round or pointed arches whispered of the divine, of order beyond earthly toil. There's a stillness to an unopened door. And yet, in daily life, medieval doors were never still for long. They opened dozens of times each day. Not for guests, always, sometimes for chickens, for firewood, for the breeze of spring. Builders knew these openings were repetitive and had to last. So many crafted their door frames wider on the inside than the outside, tapered like funnels. This kept out drafts, channeled smoke, and added structural integrity without extra materials. It was engineering cloaked in elegance. At night, doors were barred from within, with thick wooden beams that dropped into grooved sockets. No modern bolts. No keys. Just weight and resistance. The knowledge that danger didn't always announce itself politely. Yet some doors had peepholes, tiny squares or slits for watching, for listening. Builders anticipated human worry and offered design as reassurance. The window, though, the window was another kind of miracle. It was the eye of the building, and like eyes, it could be clear, or clouded, wide or narrow. Windows were rare in the homes of the poor, where every opening risked heat escaping. But where they existed, they were crafted with the same precision as doors. Shutters were made of wood thick enough to stop wind and wild dogs alike, and many swung inward, not outward, allowing the family to control their view of the world, not the other way around. Some windows were glazed, a luxury. Blown glass panes, if present, were imperfect, rippling like pond water. Poorer homes used oiled parchment, or even animal bladder stretched taut to create translucent coverings. These let in light, if not clear vision, and offered a kind of softened view of the world, shadows instead of faces, movement instead of detail. In the quiet hours, this haze became protection. Builders had given the gift of partial clarity. The size of windows was also deliberate. Large enough to allow daylight, but small enough to avoid structural weakness. Too wide, and you risked collapse. Too narrow, and the room stayed dim. Builders calculated these dimensions not with rulers but with memory. Experience passed through hands, not drawings. They knew where the sun fell at each hour, which wall bore the brunt of the wind, which corner needed the earliest light for morning tasks. Every window was a map of intention. Stone structures had deeply recessed windows, creating alcoves where people could sit, sew, or watch without being seen. Wooden cottages often had smaller, higher-set openings, out of reach of thieves, yes, but also out of reach of the rising damp. Builders made these choices not in haste, but with quiet foresight. Some windows were paired with seats carved into the thick stone, a kind of medieval reading nook. These weren't luxuries but thoughtful integrations. Spaces where warmth could gather, and time could soften. To sit beside a window and watch the road meant more than idling. It was how one learned who had left for pilgrimage, who had not returned from war, who had been crying outside the mill. Windows in churches were something else entirely. They reached upward, tall and narrow, leading the eye to heaven. Light passed through colored glass in patterns so precise they told stories to those who couldn't read. Builders weren't just thinking about bricks or frames. They were thinking about all. About how to let God into a building without opening a door. Back in the village, a single window might change how a family felt at dusk. To sit in a home with one source of light, candle, hearth, or slit of sky, was to live inside a poem of shadows. Builders didn't banish darkness. They framed it. Some homes had interior shutters, layers that could be opened or closed like pages in a book. A window wasn't one thing, it could be many, depending on the weather, the season, or the mood of the house. These layers kept heat in, yes, but also offered privacy in rooms that were otherwise shared entirely. Children learned to recognize the rhythm of doors and windows. When the shutters were closed early, it meant storm. When the door was bolted before the church bell, it meant danger. These openings taught just as much as the people who used them. And builders, quietly, invisibly, had given them those teachers. You can almost hear it now. The creak of iron hinges. The hollow thump of a wooden bar dropped into place. The soft breath of wind through bladder-thin window coverings. These were not flaws of primitive architecture. They were deliberate, functional symphonies of material and meaning. And always, the builders worked with what they had. Local wood. Local stone. Local air. Their genius wasn't in invention, but adaptation. In making each opening serve not only a household, but a philosophy, that light was precious, and warmth was sacred. That privacy and protection were earned through craft. A medieval door closed not with a click, but with a sigh. A window opened not with a crank, but with the lifting of a latch and a moment of faith. The builders knew that every home was a boundary, and they honored that boundary with care, with curves, with structure that felt less like walls, and more like choices. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine the sound above your head. Not thunder, not wind, but the soft, steady hush of rain as it slips across a thick blanket of thatch. This is not a modern rooftop, not tiles or shingles or engineered panels. This is centuries-old craft, born from straw and skill, from the slow weaving of reeds harvested from riverbanks, dried under the sun, and stacked by hand. In the medieval world, the roof was more than shelter. It was insulation, soundproofing, protection, and pride, a structure as alive and breathing as the people beneath it. To live under thatch was to live under something both fragile and enduring. At first glance, it looked like something borrowed from a bird's nest, rough, wild, impossible. But step inside a well-built cottage, and you'd feel the difference. Even in the coldest months, the air beneath that thick covering stayed warmer than you'd expect. The layers, sometimes 2 or 3 feet deep, trapped not just heat, but quiet. The world outside might rage with wind or snow, but inside, the thatch absorbed and hushed the sound, as if the house itself had drawn a thick woolen blanket over its shoulders. Medieval builders knew how to choose the right thatching materials. Not every straw would do. Water reed, wheat straw, heather, broom, each had its season, each its use. Reeds lasted longest, sometimes 50 years or more with careful upkeep. The key was dryness. Thatched roofs didn't rot because they were wet. They rotted because they didn't dry. So the angle of the roof was everything. Too shallow, and rain would linger. Too steep, and the weight of the straw would slide. Most roofs were pitched between 45 and 60 degrees, sharp enough to let rain flow swiftly, but strong enough to carry snow in winter without collapse. Building a thatched roof wasn't quick. Thatchers worked layer by layer, bottom to top, overlapping each bundle like fish scales or feathers. Each handful of straw was tied down with twisted hazel rods or wooden pegs driven through the thatch and anchored to the timber frame beneath. There were no nails. No glue. Just tension, friction, and centuries of trial and error passed from hands to hands. Beneath that thatch, the timber frame was just as carefully chosen. Notched and fitted like puzzle pieces, mortise and tenon joints locked together with pegs that swelled in damp air, tightening their grip as seasons changed. These wooden skeletons flexed with the wind rather than resisting it, giving the house a kind of slow, graceful motion. Some compared it to the sway of ships at harbor. The house didn't fight the weather, it yielded. Builders let their wood season for years. Fresh timber, green, wood, was never used in a hurry. It had to rest, to release moisture, to find its final shape before it could become part of a wall or a beam. They understood that rushing meant warping, that patience gave strength. A cottage might take a year or more to raise, and the roof was the final crown, the last line drawn against the sky. Inside, the roof changed the room. It wasn't just above you, it surrounded you. Thatched eaves extended far beyond the walls, creating deep shadows and keeping water away from foundations. Some cottages had small attics or lofts under the slope of the thatch, storage for grain, herbs, dried meat, or even a child's bed in warmer seasons. The thick straw created a muffled silence in those upper spaces, where time seemed to slow and dust floated like snow. In colder regions, homes added another layer of insulation. Wattle and daub walls, woven sticks covered in mud and straw, held heat surprisingly well when paired with a thick thatch above. Some families lined the inside of the roof with cloth or old sacks, tacked between beams to trap rising warmth from the fire. Every layer mattered. Every surface had a purpose. Nothing was purely decoration. Every decision was about survival. Thatched roofs were alive in another way, too. They hosted life. Birds nested in their edges. Insects burrowed into the outer layers. Moths sometimes crept across their peaks. This wasn't always a problem. A healthy thatch could withstand such visitors. In fact, they were part of the ecology of the home. Reminders that even the boundary between indoors and outdoors was porous, seasonal, shared. But thatch was flammable. Builders knew this, and many medieval homes included stone hearths or fire hoods that directed smoke away from the roof. Some chimneys were added later, narrow, winding shafts of brick or clay-lined wood that funneled heat safely upward. Others relied on the central hearth method, where smoke rose to the rafters and drifted through a smoke hole, seasoning the beams and warming the thatch from beneath. Over time, the smoke blackened the interior, preserving the timber from insects and rot. In wealthier homes or churches, roofs took other forms. Slate tiles, carefully quarried and split, were laid like dragon scales across stone buildings. These roofs lasted centuries but required skilled masons and heavy support. They shed snow and rain effortlessly and gave cities their sharp silhouettes. In colder climates, some buildings used turf, thick sod laid over timber, rooted with grass that kept heat in and wind out. These roofs looked like hillsides from a distance, blending into the landscape like a secret. What tied all these techniques together was intention. Nothing was wasted. Builders understood how air moved, how water flowed, how light filtered. They worked not against nature but with it. They listened to the creak of beams, the hiss of rain, the sag of straw after snow. And they adjusted. A roof wasn't finished once it was raised. It was watched, maintained, mended each spring and autumn. A sagging eave might mean a failed peg. A drip in the corner might mean mice had burrowed too deep. A new shadow might mean something had shifted in the sky. These signs weren't ignored. They were read, like weather, like scripture. To keep a roof over one's head was a daily act of attention, not just a one-time feat of labor. Even the smell of a medieval roof told a story. The scent of dry straw, of old smoke, of oiled wood. To children, it meant safety. To elders, it meant memory. And in the silence of winter, when wind pressed against the walls and snow whispered against the thatch, the roof became more than shelter. It became a blanket of history. And so the medieval roof, humble as it was, endures in the records of time, not just as architecture, but as an intimate, physical metaphor for the way people lived. Layered, patient, weathered, and resilient. A thing built not just with hands, but with wisdom, passed down beam by beam, straw by straw. The day begins not with sound, but with breath. Cold breath. Visible breath. The kind that escapes your mouth in faint puffs as your eyes open, still heavy from the chill of the night. The fire has long since died. Only the faintest heat lingers in the stones at the hearth's edge, a sleepy warmth that fades with every moment the sun stays behind the clouds. It's time to wake the house, and in the medieval world, that always began with the fire. In almost every home, no matter how grand or how humble, the fire was placed at the very center. Not always enclosed. Not always shielded. Just a low stone platform on the packed earth, where coals could rest through the night and flames could be coaxed awake in the morning. Chimneys, as we understand them now, were rare in early medieval dwellings. Instead, smoke rose freely, curling upward into the rafters, darkening beams, staining cloth, and finally finding its way out through vents in the roof, or the small gaps between wooden planks. To live in a house with no chimney was not unusual. It was expected. The air was not clean, but it was warm. The smoke did not just cook food, it preserved meat, repelled insects, and seasoned the timber above. Over time, the beams turned black with soot, and in doing so, became less prone to rot, less tempting to worms. It was not just fire that protected the house, it was the very smoke that seemed, at times, to choke it. Firewood was precious. It had to be gathered in the right season, stacked, seasoned, protected. Wet wood smoked too much. Rotten wood crumbled. Good firewood, solid, dry, dense, was gold in the colder months. Peasants often walked miles for fallen branches or negotiated with landlords for the right to gather twigs in the forest. A household that burned its fuel wastefully could find itself cold before the next thaw. Starting the fire was no simple affair either. There were no matches, no lighters, no conveniences. Flint and steel might be used, or a glowing ember saved from the night before. Some homes kept smoldering coals buried under ashes, sleeping until morning when a puff of breath and a handful of straw might rouse them. Others bartered for fire, sending a child to a neighbor's home with a ceramic pot to bring back a flame. Fire was shared. Fire was community. And fire, above all, was survival. The placement of the hearth, usually central, was deliberate. It allowed the heat to radiate evenly throughout the single-room cottage. Furniture was arranged in circles around it. Beds closest to the fire were for the elders, the children, the sick. In noble homes, fires might be placed against walls and separated by grand stone mantels, but the intention remained warmth, light, and the slow comfort of a burning heart within the walls. Cooking happened in shifts, with pots hung on iron tripods or set atop stones. Thick stews bubbled slowly throughout the day, absorbing flavor, preserving heat. Bread dough was nestled near the fire to rise, then buried in the ashes to bake. Meat, when available, was suspended on hooks or skewers, turning slowly by hand. The medieval kitchen, if you could call it that, was not a room. It was the fire. And yet, the hearth was more than heat. It was story. It was gathering. Evenings brought songs, riddles, whispered prayers, and silent stares into flame. The light flickered on rough-hewn beams and cast long shadows on sleeping children. Here, under the smoke-stained rafters, mothers stitched wool by firelight, fathers mended tools, and elders told tales that stretched backward into generations. Smoke, though burdensome, became a familiar ghost. It wove itself into clothing, into hair, into the very walls. Visitors would notice it instantly, the scent of hearth and home, at once foreign and inviting. But for those who lived within it, the smoke was not intrusion. It was atmosphere. It was the unseen layer of protection between bone-chilling frost and the fragile warmth of breath and blood. Firelight created zones within the room, the known and the unknown. Outside its reach lay darkness, uncertainty, perhaps even danger. But near the fire, things were visible, understandable, familiar. A single candle in the far corner might fight for space, but it was the hearth that reigned. Its glow marked the edge between day and night, between safety and the great unknown beyond the threshold. Richer households had more than one hearth, sometimes with flues that channeled smoke upward and out. But even these had to be maintained carefully. Chimneys, when they did appear, were prone to soot buildup and fire hazards. Sweeps and servants were employed to clean them. In poorer homes, the family themselves took on the task, climbing the roof, tapping soot loose with long rods, or scraping buildup by hand. Dangerous, dirty work, but necessary. In monasteries and manors alike, the hearth took on spiritual meaning. It became a place of vigil, a site of contemplation. Monks warmed their hands before long hours of prayer. Pilgrims dried their feet by its warmth. Letters were written in its glow, books copied line by line. Fire was not just physical heat, it was the illumination of thought, of comfort, of presence. The ashes, too, had their place. Nothing was wasted. Cooled ash was swept and stored, used in soap making, cleaning, fertilizing gardens, or mixed into the daub for repairs. Even in its death, the fire served a purpose. To live beside it was to know its rhythms, when to feed it, when to leave it alone, when to stir it, when to let it die. Children were taught from a young age to respect the fire. Not to fear it, but to understand it. A misplaced log, an unattended spark, a dry reed too close, these were lessons learned quickly, often painfully. But in time, fire became a companion. Predictable. Needed. Alive. In places where fuel was scarce, homes found other ways to hold warmth. Heavy tapestries were hung on stone walls. Rush mats were laid on the floor. Beds were built into alcoves with thick curtains to trap body heat. Warmth was layered, not given. Achieved, not assumed. And yet, despite the labor and danger, fire remained beloved. It danced in silence. It filled the room with motion when all else stood still. It made shadows move, faces glow, and stories linger. In many ways, the hearth was the oldest piece of furniture, older than chairs, older than beds, because it came first. Before the house was finished, the fire was lit. Before the family gathered, the flame was born. And when the day was done, when cloaks were hung and tools put away, the fire remained, low, steady, glowing like a buried star. The last sound before sleep was the crackle of wood, the soft shifting of coals, and the gentle sigh of warmth, holding back the night. The cold came slowly at first. It did not arrive with thunder or frost, but with a strange stillness in the air, a silence that crept through the village lanes like a warning. The trees, once ablaze with autumn fire, stood bare and solemn. The sky, once alive with birdsong, turned a flat and breathless gray. For those in the medieval countryside, winter did not simply change the weather. It rearranged the entire rhythm of life, and those who were not prepared felt it first in their bellies, then in their bones. In most peasant homes, food was never guaranteed. But in winter, scarcity was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. The grain stores, carefully measured and protected from rats, were already showing gaps. The salted meat hung from rafters in small, precious bundles, enough to last a noble family, perhaps, but not a crowded cottage of 10 souls. Every crust of bread became an heirloom. Every onion a relic. Children were taught not to ask for more. They learned, instead, to choose slowly and keep quiet. The bread itself changed. Gone were the round, brown loaves that had warmed hands in the summer light. Winter bread was coarse, bitter, stretched thin with barley or bean flour. Some women ground dried acorns into powder, or soaked old crusts and pressed them into fresh shapes. Anything to stave off the rising hunger. The ovens in village homes were rarely used now, not for lack of desire, but for lack of fuel. Firewood was hoarded like gold. A baking day might come only once a week, if that, and neighbors would sometimes gather around a shared fire to warm dough with what little they had left. Fires became sacred. In the heart of each dwelling, the hearth no longer symbolized mere warmth, it symbolized survival. Smoke drifted from thatched roofs in thin wisps, a sign of life still enduring inside. But the fire could not burn all day. Wood was rationed with care. A log here, a branch there. Ashes were preserved and reused. Children woke in the dark to blow on coals from the night before, coaxing tiny embers back into flame with careful breath. The hearth became a whispered prayer, its soft crackling a lullaby against the howling wind. Outside, the roads grew treacherous. Paths turned to ice. Footprints froze in place. Markets thinned. The traders who once brought salt and cloth now stayed behind shuttered stalls. Those who dared to walk the snowy lanes wrapped themselves in every available scrap of wool or linen, not for fashion, but for life. Shoes were patched again and again, and many went barefoot even in snow, their feet red and numb, their steps slow but determined. Water, too, changed its nature. Streams once used for washing and drinking now sat frozen and silent. Breaking the ice became a morning ritual. Buckets were filled with urgency, because if the sun disappeared, which it often did, the next thaw might not come until dusk. Ice was brought into homes and melted by firelight, dripped into mouths like medicine. Water, which once flowed freely, now came in spoonfuls and sighs. Illness thrived in such cold. A single cough could echo through a household like a warning bell. With little medicine and less understanding, peasants turned to charms and chants. Garlic hung by doorways. Herbal bundles were burned to ward off evil. When someone fell ill, they were wrapped in every blanket, every rag, and prayed over. Children learned not to cry too loudly. They did not want to draw the attention of whatever spirits might be passing in the wind. And yet, there was resilience in the gloom. A kind of quiet courage that held the village together. Families shared what they could. A ladle of soup here, a split turnip there. No one had enough, but no one dared to hoard too much either, not for fear of theft, but for fear of judgment. Reputation mattered, even in starvation. To be seen as selfish was worse than to go hungry. The church remained a source of both hope and burden. Its doors stayed open, and inside candles flickered even on the darkest days. People gathered there not only for Mass, but for warmth. Sermons in winter were colder in tone. Priests spoke of endurance, of penitence, of finding grace in suffering. The Virgin and her child were often invoked, not in celebration, but as reminders of poverty made holy. Mothers wept quietly in pews, their children sleeping on stone floors. Some nights, the sky cleared. Stars appeared like silver dust over the frozen earth. And in those rare moments, families might gather outside their doors, wrapped in cloaks and silence, just to look upward. There was something comforting in the vastness. In knowing that above the hunger, above the struggle, the stars still burned, unchanged, untouchable. In these months, time moved strangely. Days were short, but nights seemed endless. People slept more, huddled together in corners like animals. Dreams came heavier. Some said they dreamed of bread, of sun-warmed fields, of songs from long ago. Others said they dreamed of nothing, as if even their minds had grown weary from the cold. Children played less. There were no games in the snow, no joy in ice. They became quieter, older somehow, as if winter added years to their eyes. They helped more, carrying water, watching younger siblings, fetching twigs for kindling. A child who once feared the dark now stood guard by the hearth while parents worked in silence. These were not small roles. They were survival. When death came, and it often did, it came softly. A grandmother who never woke. A neighbor lost in the snow. A cough that turned to silence. Graves were dug in frozen ground with blunted tools and aching arms. The village paused each time, not in panic, but in weary respect. Life was fragile. Everyone knew it. And yet, with every death came a deeper resolve to carry on. To reach the thaw. To see the frost melt from the hedgerows. To smell the damp earth again. Hope, though quiet, was never absent. It lived in the way people stirred ashes into flame. In the way a mother saved the last bite for her child. In the way hands were clasped during prayer, tightly, fiercely, as if willing spring to return. Winter in the medieval village was not just a season. It was a teacher. It taught patience, sacrifice, humility. It stripped away vanity and left only what mattered: warmth, food, family, and faith. And those who survived it emerged not unchanged, but sharpened. They remembered each bitter morning, each shared crust, each silent vigil. And they carried those memories into every green shoot of spring. Death was not a stranger in the medieval village. It was a neighbor. A presence known and named, not hidden behind curtains or softened with euphemisms. It walked the muddy lanes in plain sight, greeted with ritual and resignation, and left behind silence so familiar it felt like part of the household. Chapter 9 unfolds beneath that silence, in a world where mortality was not a fear so much as a companion, where the tolling of the village bell marked not just loss, but the rhythm of ordinary life. In the cold stillness of dawn, a single bell would echo through the fields, low and slow, its voice cutting through frost like a chisel. No one needed to ask what it meant. The knell announced that someone had died. Not a noble, not a king, but a neighbor. Perhaps the old woman who lived in the leaning cottage by the hedgerow. Perhaps the blacksmith's youngest, whose cough had grown quiet overnight. The sound of the bell rolled over thatched roofs and frozen gardens, and every hearth in the village fell quiet. Inside each cottage, mothers paused their work. Children stopped playing with the scraps of wood or rags they called toys. A bowl was placed down without a spoon returning to it. The sound of death was not loud, but it carried weight. It asked for silence. It asked for acknowledgement. And so the village listened. The dying did not leave quickly. Often they lingered, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The process was slow, intimate, and shared. The entire family, and often neighbors too, would gather around the straw pallet. Candles were lit even in daylight, flickering symbols of the soul about to pass. Prayers were whispered, even by those who could barely remember the Latin. Psalms were sung softly, cracked with grief or dry from fatigue. The dying were not kept apart. They were touched, held, spoken to. Hands were clasped, brows wiped, water spooned between cracked lips. Sometimes the dying spoke, offering blessings or apologies. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Their silence was still a kind of presence, something sacred, almost holy. Children were present too. There was no shielding them from death. They watched, they learned. They came to understand that this was part of the cycle, as ordinary, in its own way, as the planting of seeds or the mending of a tunic. The absence of fear did not mean the absence of sorrow. But it did mean that grief was a shared, familiar path, not a lonely and terrifying cliff. When death finally came, there were rituals to follow. The body was washed, not by strangers, but by kin. The act was one of love and labor, a final service. Hair was combed. Hands were crossed. A simple shroud was wrapped around the limbs. Coins, if any could be spared, were placed over the eyes or in the mouth, a nod to ancient traditions, half remembered, half sacred. The body was laid out in the home, sometimes for a full day or more, as friends and family came to offer prayers or simply sit in silence. The church bell rang again when the funeral began. This time in a different pattern, the passing bell, which marked the soul's journey beyond. Villagers gathered, not out of obligation, but out of custom and care. Even those who could not spare food would find a way to bring a candle or a piece of wool to the grieving family. The funeral was a communal act, a moment when the entire village leaned toward the same shadowed threshold. The coffin, if there was one, was simple. Often it was just a wooden plank or a woven bier. The procession walked slowly to the churchyard, children trailing behind, the priest at the front with his voice raised in holy chant. The ground was already hardened from the frost. Digging the grave was laborious. Sometimes it was done in shifts. Sweat steamed from backs even as snow dusted hair and shoulders. At the graveside, the priest spoke again. Dust to dust. Earth to earth. The villagers crossed themselves. A handful of soil was scattered over the body. And then, slowly, people drifted back to their homes, walking through the same paths they'd taken just the day before, only now with the absence of one more face among them. But death did not end there. Mourning was not brief. For days, sometimes weeks, the absence was palpable. Meals were quieter. The empty chair by the hearth seemed larger than the cottage itself. In time, the family might wear tokens of grief, a scrap of dark cloth, or a wooden charm shaped like a cross. Some lit a candle each night in remembrance. Some sang the old songs softly while they worked, as if trying to carry the memory forward. There was fear, too, especially during times of plague or famine. Sometimes the bell rang too often. Some winters saw graves dug side by side, so close the earth barely settled between them. During these times, death felt less like a visitor and more like a storm, relentless, indiscriminate. People turned to the church with greater urgency. Saints were invoked. Pilgrimages promised. And still, the tolling continued. But even in these darkest stretches, the medieval soul clung to meaning. Death was not the end, it was a passage. A door, not a wall. The body might be lost, but the soul moved on, to purgatory, to judgment, to whatever heaven could be imagined by those who had lived their lives in hunger and labor. That belief, more than anything, gave death its shape, its sharpness, its mercy. And so the bell continued. Through centuries. Through seasons. Each note a reminder that life was precious because it ended. That every shared crust, every song by the fire, every small act of kindness was worth treasuring, because it would not come again. In the medieval village, death was not hidden. It was lived. And in that living, it was softened by the warmth of those left behind. The morning began not with words, but with the groaning hush of weight shifting overhead. In the dark belly of the earth, where stone met soil and voices grew cautious, you woke not to birdsong but to the slow settling of centuries. This was the cellar beneath a medieval home, a low, damp hollow carved from cold ground and old breath. The air hung heavy, thick with moisture and mildew. Wooden beams overhead creaked faintly, as if remembering the men who raised them long ago. This was not a place of comfort, but of purpose. Storage. Survival. Secrecy. You pulled the wool blanket tighter around your shoulders, though it did little to keep the chill from slipping beneath your skin. All around you, the walls pressed inward, not menacingly, but like time itself was leaning against them. Above, life stirred in slow rhythms, footsteps overhead, a murmur of voices by the hearth, the clatter of a wooden ladle against an iron pot. But down here, beneath the house, the world moved differently. Time dripped instead of marched. Sound traveled in whispers. And the past, it seemed, lived just a little closer to the surface. This cellar, like many across the countryside, served multiple lives in its quiet shadows. It held sacks of grain tied shut with fraying cords. Jars of salted meat lined wooden shelves like silent guards. Rows of withered garlic hung from the ceiling beams, each bulb a charm against sickness. Beneath your feet, a patchwork of compacted dirt and rough flagstones bore the imprint of countless feet, generations walking, crouching, storing, praying. In the far corner, a single candle burned low, casting long shadows across the uneven walls. Its flame danced like a restless spirit, casting just enough light to keep the darkness from swallowing everything whole. It was not uncommon for families to sleep here during harsh winters or times of unrest. The earth offered insulation, cool in summer, warm enough in winter to stave off death. But it also offered quiet. And in the medieval world, quiet was more than comfort, it was safety. Above ground, the world could be loud and dangerous. Reeve patrols, drunken brawls, fires that consumed entire streets. But below, in these dark places, a family could vanish for a night, tucked beneath the living weight of their own home. You watched as the eldest daughter, perhaps 16, lifted a jug from the shelf with practiced care. She did not rush. No one rushed here. Each movement was deliberate, slow, and weighted with memory. She wiped dust from the rim with the edge of her sleeve and passed it silently to her younger brother. He was no older than 8, but he bore the same watchful look of someone who had learned early that noise was costly. Together they moved through the dim space like ghosts in training, present but unnoticed. The walls told their own story. Scratches marked where tools had once hung. A faded cross had been carved above the door lintel, protection, perhaps, from things that moved in darkness. In the center of the back wall, a wide stone slab served as a preparation table in leaner months and a makeshift altar when needed. Births, bindings, blessings, they happened here, quietly. Away from the eyes of neighbors and the ears of priests. The cellar remembered everything the village forgot. In wealthier homes, cellars were deeper and more elaborate, with vaulted ceilings, tiled floors, and hidden chambers. In peasant cottages, they were often little more than widened pits dug with aching hands and reinforced with scavenged timber. But regardless of their size, they all shared one purpose: to hold what mattered when the world outside could not be trusted. And so, beneath nearly every home, there was a space like this one, secret, sacred in its own way, and humming softly with the breath of those who had waited out storms above and within. You stepped carefully toward the stairs. They were narrow, uneven, carved from the same stone that lined the walls. Your fingers grazed the rough edge of the banister, and in that moment, you felt something odd, warmth. Not from the wood, but from the memories it held. Hands had clutched this rail in moments of fear and hope. Children fleeing thunder. mothers carrying bundles of food down before the harvest ran dry. Fathers returning with news best spoken in private. The stairs had borne more than weight, they had carried stories. Above, the light grew stronger. The faint golden wash of early morning crept in through cracks in the floorboards. Dust floated like breath held too long. You paused on the bottom step and looked back. The candle flickered once, then steadied. Behind you, the room waited, not empty, but full of something deeper than possessions. It was heavy with quiet, thick with remembering. You knew you'd return. When you emerged into the main room, the contrast was startling. Not bright, but brighter. The hearth was lit, its coals a dull orange beneath a pile of blackened wood. A pot hung suspended above the flames, steam curling from its mouth. The smell was faintly sour, boiled roots and yesterday's scraps. Hunger sharpened your senses. A woman, not young, not old, stirred the pot with a kind of resigned grace. She did not look up, but her body shifted slightly as you entered. She knew you were there. This was the heart of the home, both literally and symbolically. Everything radiated from this central point. Meals, warmth, conversation, correction. There was no privacy in a single-room cottage. Everything was seen, heard, shared. Emotions, too, joy was felt communally, and sorrow spread like smoke from the fire. You took your place near the wall, where the light touched the floor but not your eyes. Watching, listening, becoming part of the house's rhythm once more. Children woke slowly, their limbs tangled in wool and each other. The baby, cradled in a basket by the fire, whimpered and then settled. An old man, perhaps the grandfather, though no one ever said, coughed until his chest rattled. No one reacted. He did this every morning. Life resumed as it always did, one breath, one movement, one small acceptance at a time. Mid-morning brought more noise, the kind that signaled the return of the outside world. A knock at the door. A shout from the lane. The scrape of boots on stone. But within these walls, the cellar still waited, a place untouched by the sun, where time grew thick and the weight of silence offered a kind of peace. You found yourself glancing toward the trapdoor again, wondering what it would feel like to descend alone, candle in hand, with only the stone to listen. By evening, the cellar would welcome its people once more. Not for hiding this time, but for necessity. The cold would return. The stew would be ladled out. And someone, likely the girl with careful hands, would descend to fetch another jug, another jar, another memory. And so the rhythm would continue. The house above lived in daylight. But the soul of the family, the memory of their endurance, it lived below. And in that way, even without speaking, the cellar told its story, of hunger endured, of warmth preserved, of lives shaped quietly in shadow. It was not grand. It was not tragic. It was simply true. And that, perhaps, was the most sacred thing of all. The wind was sharp long before you stepped outside. It threaded itself through the cracks in the timber walls, slid beneath the uneven doorframe, and wrapped itself around the ankles of everyone in the house. It carried no snow yet, but there was frost in its breath, the kind that signaled the arrival of true cold, the kind that made water in the bucket stiffen before the fire even died down. No one rushed toward it. But the morning work waited for no warmth. You stirred beneath your blanket just as the first light broke across the edge of the sky. Gray, not golden. Pale like bone. One of the children, the middle one perhaps, was already crouched near the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life with careful puffs of breath and small twigs split thin as grass. The others still slept in a tangled heap, their bodies pressed together for shared warmth, the way animals do in a burrow. The eldest girl had already gone, her shawl missing from its nail, her footsteps faint on the dirt floor. There was no breakfast waiting. Not yet. Just a hint of boiled oats, maybe, if there was enough left from the last harvest. But no one expected more. Food was never promised. What mattered now was movement, out of bed, into boots, toward the chores that filled every daylight hour. You rubbed your eyes with hands still numb and reached for your woolen tunic, stiff with yesterday's smoke and the damp of unheated air. Outside, the cold didn't greet you. It claimed you. It reached into your ears, your lungs, the tips of your fingers. It was a kind of silence that roared. Your breath emerged in plumes, each one drifting upward like a whisper made visible. All around, the village stirred in slow patterns. Doors creaked open, smoke climbed hesitantly from crooked chimneys, and figures emerged like shadows waking from stone. You stepped onto the path, little more than packed mud gone stiff from the freeze. To your left, the field stretched bare and skeletal, furrows black against the silver white of frost. No green. No fruit. Only the memory of labor. To your right, the animals stirred in their pens, a thin goat blinking at the light, a hen shaking frost from its feathers, a pig nosing the earth as if it could summon roots from frozen ground. This was the part of life few songs mentioned. There were no trumpets in the morning. No noble declarations or grand beginnings. Just aching feet, cold breath, and a long list of things that had to be done before dark. And yet, in this rhythm, there was something more powerful than victory, endurance. The sheer, steady survival of another day. At the well, 2 women were already drawing water, one older, wrapped in layers too thin, the other young with eyes that looked older than they should. They did not speak until the buckets were filled. Their hands moved without thought, without question. You joined them silently, nodding once, and began to pull the rope. The well groaned as the bucket descended, its echo rising from below like the voice of the earth. Water was life here. Not just for drinking or washing, but for softening leather, mixing with flour, soaking cloth, and feeding the fire that warmed the stew pot. Every drop mattered. And so, every trip to the well became a kind of ritual, slow, patient, almost reverent. When your arms ached from pulling and the cold had begun to settle deeper into your chest, you carried the sloshing bucket back toward the house. Behind you, the village moved in quiet symmetry. Smoke, footsteps, breath, all lifting into the sky as the sun strained to rise. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a baby cried. But mostly, there was only this, the long, deliberate beginning of another day. Inside, the hearth was brighter. Someone had coaxed a small fire into life. The pot had been hung, oats added, and a wooden spoon rested on the bench. The youngest child stood barefoot, shivering but smiling, holding a clay cup as if it were gold. You knelt beside the fire and poured water into a second pot, watching the steam rise slowly, like a prayer being answered. There were no clocks here. No bells to mark the hour. Time passed in light and shadow, in the angle of smoke, in the weight of chores left undone. The rhythm of the day was written in the tasks themselves. Water fetched, animals fed, wood chopped, bread kneaded, cloth mended, grain measured, walls patched, roof checked, wool spun. There was always something. Always another step toward the evening. You heard footsteps return, the eldest girl, her cheeks pink with cold, her arms full of firewood. She said nothing, just set the bundle down, and crouched near the door to unlace her boots. Her fingers were red, her breath shallow. But her eyes flicked to the fire, then to the children. She had done her part, and now the day could go on. In a corner, the grandfather sat hunched over a small wooden box, a puzzle of worn nails and hinges. He opened it slowly, revealing a handful of tools, a bone awl, a wooden comb, a tiny knife dulled from years of sharpening. These were not toys. They were the fragments of his trade, once useful, now kept mostly out of habit. He began to polish the comb with a strip of wool, murmuring softly as he worked. No one interrupted him. By noon, the light had strengthened, but not warmed. The wind still pulled at the thatch, rattling it like a reminder that winter had not yet begun in earnest. You felt it in your bones, not fear, exactly, but respect. For the cold. For the quiet. For the long shadow of night that would come again, no matter how hard you worked or how carefully you prepared. You stood near the doorway, watching the village move in its silent, purposeful dance. Every house repeated the same motions. Every family followed the same invisible script. And yet, in each home, there were small differences. A gesture. A tone of voice. A way of folding the cloth over the bread. This was how people survived, not just by following the rules, but but by weaving their own threads into the fabric of the day. Evening would come soon. The light would fade. The fire would be stoked. And once again, the family would gather close, wrapped in wool and silence, eating slowly, thinking rarely of anything beyond tomorrow's work. But for now, you stood in the middle of it all, one breath ahead of the cold, one heartbeat deeper into the story. And though nothing grand had happened, no war, no love, no revelation, the day itself had been enough. It had been survived. It had been lived. And that, in the end, was the real miracle of medieval life. There are days when time seems to stretch without end. Days when the sun moves slowly, reluctantly, as if it too is tired of circling the same sky. Today was one of those days. A stillness clung to the village, not the kind born of peace, but the kind that feels like waiting. For what? No one knew exactly. Perhaps for snow. Perhaps for change. But more likely, just for the next moment to pass without incident. You woke to a sky the color of pewter. No birds called. No wind stirred. The silence was deep enough to be heard. Even the trees, bare and brittle, seemed to hold their breath. In the cottage, the embers had died low in the hearth, leaving only a faint red glow and a few coils of smoke rising toward the darkened rafters. Someone had rolled over in the night, and taken more than their share of the blanket. You didn't blame them. Getting up was an act of will. The air bit at your skin like something alive. Every motion was stiff, not from sleep, but from the weight of many days just like this. You reached for the same tunic, the same woolen stockings, the same belt that had grown thin from use. Nothing here changed quickly. That was both comfort and curse. Outside, the village looked like it had been painted in gray. Frost clung to the thatch. The paths were silent, hard-packed with ice. Even the dogs were quiet, curled in bundles of straw beside doorways, their breath rising in little bursts. You moved slowly, careful not to slip. No one wanted a broken bone in winter. That was a death sentence if it didn't heal right. At the well, a woman was already waiting, her hands chafed red, her eyes cast downward. You nodded. She nodded. No words. None were needed. The creak of the pulley was loud in the silence. When your turn came, your fingers felt stiff against the rope, but you pulled anyway. What choice was there? Water didn't wait for warmth. It was needed, no matter the weather. You passed the baker's hut and saw no smoke. Strange. Maybe they'd run out of wood or flour. Maybe someone was sick. You didn't ask. Not yet. Asking too many questions too early made people suspicious. Everyone guarded their troubles closely. They had to. There were too many to share. At home, the others were stirring. The youngest child cried softly, not out of pain, but hunger. The kind of hunger that came from small meals and long nights. There was some barley left. Enough for a thin porridge, perhaps. It wouldn't fill the belly, but it would keep the hands moving. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. The fire took a long time to catch. Damp wood, tired breath. But eventually it came, first smoke, then spark, then flame. You sat beside it, hands outstretched, watching your fingers regain their color. Heat felt like a gift. A rare one. You didn't waste it by leaning in too far. Someone knocked at the door. A neighbor, holding a small wrapped bundle. Herbs. For a cough, she said. Her daughter had some to spare. You thanked her, and in return offered a strip of old linen, clean, pressed, saved for trade. It was a quiet kindness. Not spoken aloud. Just exchanged with eyes and hands. The way most good things were shared in these parts. The day passed slowly. You patched a tear in the sleeve of your only cloak. You checked the roof for leaks. You scraped ice from the edge of the water barrel. Not because you expected rain or thaw, but because it was something to do. Movement kept thoughts from settling too heavily. In the afternoon, the blacksmith's son passed through the lane, pulling a small cart with a broken wheel. He looked tired. You offered to help, and together, in silence, you lifted it onto a stone block to examine the axle. A splintered joint. It could be mended. You fetched a strip of boiled leather from your store, the last of what you'd saved from summer. He nodded, grateful, and left without a word. That evening, as the sky began to dim and the first flakes of snow began to drift from the clouds, you sat with your back against the wall, watching the fire dance on the stone. The others had gathered close, eating in quiet bites, savoring every spoonful. The grandfather told the story. Something about a fox that outwitted a farmer. The children smiled faintly. Not laughter, but close. The walls creaked with cold. Outside, snow gathered in the corners. The village shrank inward, doors closed, fires stoked, voices lowered. It was a time for endurance, not celebration. Still, someone sang. A low hum, almost a lullaby. You couldn't tell where it came from. It might have been the next house, or further down the lane. But it filled the air like warmth. You laid out straw near the hearth for the night. Not a bed, but enough to keep the stone from stealing too much heat. The children were already curled beneath the blanket, their breaths slow and even. You watched them for a while. Then you closed your eyes. In the dark, your thoughts wandered. Not far. Just enough to imagine a field in spring, or the taste of a warm apple, or the sound of rain that didn't come with worry. These were not dreams. Just echoes. But they were enough. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Soft, steady, silent. Covering the world in a blanket no one could afford. There are footsteps you can hear, and others you cannot. Some leave tracks in snow or dust, others leave only weight behind. The kind of weight that stays in a room long after someone has gone. Today began with those footsteps, the invisible kind. The air in the cottage felt strange. Not tense. Not light. Just different. You couldn't place it. But something had shifted. You woke before the others, which was rare. The fire had gone out completely, not even a whisper of ember left. Only cold stones and the faint scent of ash. You didn't try to rekindle it right away. Instead, you sat upright on your straw mat, staring at the wooden beam above your head, tracing the same crack with your eyes that you'd followed every morning for weeks. The crack had grown longer. Outside, the first bird hadn't yet called. That was unusual. Even in winter, even in frost, some tiny song always broke the dawn. But not today. You pulled on your cloak, stiff from yesterday's damp, and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned like an old man in pain. And beyond the threshold, a fog lay thick upon the earth. It wasn't mist. It was the kind of fog that swallowed sound, swallowed space, and made everything feel closer than it should. The village was silent. Not the soft, content silence of early morning, but the hollow, waiting silence of a world holding its breath. Even the crows, usually chattering like gossips, were still. You could hear your own footsteps on the frozen path. The rhythm felt wrong. Too loud. Too alone. You passed the well, and for the first time in memory, there was no one there. No old woman pulling water. No child with a cracked jug. Only the bucket hanging crooked, as if someone had left in a hurry. The rope twisted lazily in the air, swinging with a wind you couldn't feel. You adjusted your scarf and kept walking. Near the chapel, a door hung open. Just slightly. Enough to let the cold creep inside. You stepped closer, called out once, but your voice didn't echo. It stopped short, as if swallowed. You pushed the door fully open and stepped in. The room was empty. No candles. No priest. Just the smell of wax and wood rot. A prayer book lay open on the bench. One page torn. You didn't stay. There are moments when instinct tells you to keep moving, even if you don't know why. You crossed the square, past the butcher's stall. The meat hook swayed gently. No meat. No flies. No butcher. The table had been wiped clean. You touched it with your fingertips. It was cold, dry, and dusted with frost. Back at the cottage, the others had stirred. The children rubbed sleep from their eyes, confused by your absence. Your mother asked if you'd seen the baker. You hadn't. No smoke from his chimney. No bread for days now. She nodded quietly and said no more. She didn't need to. Her eyes held the same question yours did: where has everyone gone? By midday, the fog had lifted a little, but the silence remained. A few neighbors emerged, not many. They looked pale. Not sick. Just thinned by worry. One said the midwife was missing. Another said they saw a crow fall from the sky. Dead. Whole. No blood. Just fallen. People muttered about omens. About the land remembering something it had tried to forget. You tried to carry on. You swept the floor. Mended a sleeve. Split firewood. Normal things, to keep the strange at bay. But the weight remained. It clung to you like wet wool, dragging, heavy, and impossible to shake off. Even laughter felt dangerous today, like it might summon something ancient and listening. That evening, the moon rose too early, casting long shadows across the frozen fields. You stood at the edge of the pasture and looked out. Far off, something moved through the mist. A figure. Then another. Then gone. You didn't call out. You didn't move. You just watched. And waited. Back inside, supper was quiet. No one spoke above a whisper. The children asked questions, but the adults gave no answers. It was better that way. Safer. Truth could be sharp. Best to wrap it in silence, and feed it slowly, like bitter roots. Someone knocked once at the door, then vanished. You didn't open it. You just watched the latch and waited until your heartbeat slowed again. Later, your grandfather said this had happened before. Not exactly, but close. He remembered a winter long ago, when the snow fell wrong and the birds stopped singing. People vanished then, too. Not in crowds. One by one. Like leaves from a tree. Quiet, steady, and final. No screams. No blood. Just absence. He said it passed eventually. But things were never the same. People looked at each other differently after. As if every neighbor might be next. Or might already be gone inside, even if their bodies still sat by the fire. He said you'd understand when you were older. But you already did. You lay down early that night. Sleep didn't come easily. Shadows moved across the rafters. Not from firelight, there was none. Just the play of moon and wine through the cracks. You pulled the blanket tight, tucked your feet beneath your knees, and tried to remember the last time you laughed out loud. It had been weeks. As the night deepened, you dreamed of footsteps. Not your own. Not anyone's you knew. Just soft, steady steps through snow and silence. And behind them, nothing. Not even the sound of breathing. When you woke, the frost had crept in through the seams. Ice rimmed the water bowl. One of the hens had died in her sleep, her body still warm when you found her. The children cried. Not loudly. Just enough to remind you that you were still here. Still in this strange world. You buried the hen by the wall, marking the ground with a small stone. Then you stood, brushing your hands on your tunic, and looked up at the sky. It was pale, bruised with dawn. And for a moment, a single bird flew overhead. You didn't know if that meant something. But you let yourself believe it did. The earth does not forget. It holds everything. Footsteps. Secrets. The weight of bodies. The warmth of vanished fires. And some days, if you listen closely, you can hear it breathe beneath your feet, not loudly, but with a tired rhythm, like something ancient stirring in its sleep. That morning, the frost reached deeper than usual. Not just on the windows or the grass, but into your bones. You felt it behind your eyes, under your nails, in the hollow of your throat. No one spoke for the first hour after waking. Even the children moved more slowly, their small bare feet careful on the cold-packed earth floor. You lit the fire with shaking hands. The flint took longer to spark today. Not because it was damp, but because the tinder felt unwilling. As though the materials themselves resisted burning, preferring the silence. When the flames did come, they crackled softly, casting long shadows along the beams. You sat beside it and stared into the orange light, wondering what else in the house would choose not to wake. Outside, the path to the well was marked with unfamiliar prints. Not boot or paw or hoof, something else. Long, narrow, erratic. Not made by any villager. Not the baker. Not the priest. Not the midwife, whose door still hung open. You crouched beside the trail and placed your palm over it, trying to feel the warmth. But the imprint was already cold. A woman passed you without a word. Her shawl was frayed, her eyes rimmed red. She carried a bundle of herbs tied in cloth. Wormwood, nettle, and rosemary, plants for cleansing or mourning. You watched her disappear into the fog without turning her head once. Some errands needed no witness. At midday, you gathered with a few others near the chapel. The priest hadn't returned. Instead, the carpenter stood beside the altar. His hands, usually sure and precise, trembled as he lit the candles. He didn't speak a sermon. He just said, "Let us remember." And everyone nodded, as if they knew who or what he meant, though no names were spoken. You walked home by the longer path, past the crumbling wall that once enclosed the garden. Ivy had taken it now. The stones were loose, worn smooth by wind and time. You paused there, laying your hand on one of the larger rocks. It was warm. Not from sun, but from something deeper, a memory, maybe. A moment still stored inside. Inside your home, your younger brother was drawing in the dirt with a stick. Not symbols or letters. Just spirals. Over and over, until the lines formed a shape too familiar. You knelt beside him and erased it gently. He didn't protest. Just stared at your hand, then the fire, then went back to drawing circles instead. That night, a wind came. Not harsh, but insistent. It rattled shutters, pulled at the thatch, and made the rafters groan in their joints. It felt like breath. Like the land was exhaling at last, emptying its lungs of dust and history. You lay beneath your blanket and tried to match its rhythm. Inhale. Exhale. Remember. Forget. You dreamed again, not of people, but of places. Fields overgrown with thistle. A riverbed gone dry. A barn filled with feathers and no birds. Each image lingered longer than it should have, as if asking you to remember it. You woke before dawn, heart pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. In the quiet dark, you rose and opened the door. The stars were gone. A low mist hugged the earth like a blanket, rolling in slow waves across the pasture. Shapes moved within it, not quite human. You didn't look closely. Some things are safer left unrecognized. You closed the door and bolted it. The next day, the baker returned. Or someone wearing his coat did. He walked through the village without stopping. No bread. No words. Just steps that didn't match the man you remembered. His gait was wrong. His shoulders too straight. And when he passed, no breath fogged from his mouth. By evening, more had reappeared. The midwife, sweeping her doorstep. The butcher, sharpening a blade. Familiar faces, unfamiliar eyes. Everyone greeted them softly. No one asked where they'd gone. To name the silence would give it shape, and shape could too easily become truth. You took a walk just before nightfall. The sky glowed a strange gold, like fire behind glass. In the field beyond the chapel, something had been built, a cairn maybe. Stones stacked with impossible balance. No one claimed it. No one moved it. You knelt beside it, and whispered a name you hadn't spoken in years. Back inside, you added 2 logs to the fire. The warmth spread slowly, but not evenly. One corner of the room stayed cold, no matter what you did. The shadows there were longer. The floorboards creaked louder. But no one mentioned it. Everyone sat a little closer to the flames. As you drifted to sleep, you wondered what the land knew. What it carried beneath the frost. Whether each silence was a grave, and each shadow a warning. But sleep took you softly, pulling you down like water. No dreams this time. Only quiet. And the memory of stone beneath your hand. And the feeling, faint but certain, that tomorrow, something would rise. It was the kind of morning that didn't feel like morning. No sunlight cracked the sky. No birds stirred in the trees. Just a flat, pale stillness that settled on rooftops, fields, and shoulders alike. You rose without knowing why, not from hunger, not from sound, just a quiet tug in your chest, as if something had reached across the hours of night and gently pulled you forward. The fire had died in the hearth. Not burned down, died. You ran your hand through the ash and felt nothing. No lingering heat, no hidden coal waiting to glow. The coals were white and silent, like they'd never been fire at all. You didn't rebuild it. Not yet. Not this morning. There was something about the cold that felt necessary. Outside, the path had changed. The usual divots, footprints, and cartwheel ruts were gone, wiped smooth, as though the land had stretched in its sleep and erased the scars of human use. Your feet made no sound on the dirt. Even the frost beneath your soles seemed to silence itself, not daring to crackle or crunch. Down by the chapel, the bell was missing. Not stolen, not broken. Just gone. The tower stood empty, the rope swaying in the breeze like a question that no one wanted to ask. You looked around at the other villagers who had gathered in ones and twos. No one mentioned it. Everyone noticed. No one said a word. The carpenter stood beside the open door, eyes closed, lips moving in a prayer no one had taught him. His tools lay untouched beside him. Not a single hammer lifted, not a nail bent. He wasn't waiting for permission to begin. He was waiting for something else entirely. Perhaps for the air to shift. For the old names to return. A little girl handed you a bundle of dried lavender. Not for scent, not for healing, but for memory. The stems were tied with black thread, not red. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. You tucked it into your sleeve and nodded once. That was enough. The graveyard beyond the chapel had grown. Not wider. Not fuller. But older. Stones you remembered as smooth now bore cracks. Letters had faded. Moss clung to names you swore had just been carved last year. The ground felt sunken. As though time had pressed its full weight down on this patch of earth in a single night. Back home, you found a letter beneath your door. No seal. No script. Just a folded page soft as cloth, with one sentence written in a hand that didn't quite look human. You remembered. You held it in your hand for a long time, unsure whether to hide it, burn it, or read it again. In the end, you placed it in the hearth, not to burn, but to keep. Later that day, the wind returned. Not harsh. Not violent. Just steady. Like a broom sweeping the village clean. Leaves lifted and danced in lazy spirals. Smoke from unfamiliar chimneys curled in unusual patterns, drifting sideways instead of upward. It was the kind of wind that made you walk slower. That made you listen. And then the animals came back. One by one. The oxen stood again in the pasture, though no one remembered opening their pens. The chickens pecked the ground without fear, as if nothing had ever hunted them. A single black dog sat by the well. Watching. Not barking. Just watching. Like it had been sent to record, not interfere. The baker opened his shutters and leaned out. No bread. Just his face, older than yesterday, eyes rimmed red. He nodded at you. Just once. You nodded back. That was enough. Across the square, the well began to groan, not with weight, but with memory. Water rose, not because it was drawn, but because it was ready. You walked toward the edge of the village. The path curved in ways you didn't remember. Trees leaned differently. The stream whispered unfamiliar names. But your feet knew where to go. Past the stone wall. Past the crumbled gate. Past the field where no one dared to harvest. And there it was. The cairn. Still standing. Taller now. Someone, or something, had added to it. The stones were warm to the touch, though the sun had never shone. You sat beside it and placed your hand on the base. It pulsed. Not with life, but with presence. Like the memory of breathing, long after a body is gone. As dusk fell, the air changed. It thickened, like soup over fire. Every breath you took tasted of smoke and time and old wood. Bells rang far away, not from your village, but from somewhere deeper. Older. You didn't flinch. You listened. Each note carried something with it. A name. A sigh. A door closing. You returned home and found your hearth already lit. The flames were low and blue, not red. They gave off little heat, but great comfort. You sat before them and felt your shoulders lower for the first time in days. Something in the house exhaled. Perhaps it was you. Sleep came without warning. Not like falling, but like sinking. Down through layers of memory and earth and breath. You dreamed of wooden beams whispering to each other. Of hands weaving rope from hair. Of stones arranging themselves into perfect walls without being touched. And in that dream you heard a voice say, "This is what remains when everything else is forgotten." When you woke, the air was soft again. Light filtered through the window, pale, golden, forgiving. You rose slowly, aware that you were carrying something new. Not knowledge. Not grief. But a quiet understanding. The past does not vanish. It folds itself into the land, into the grain of wood and the cracks in stone. It speaks in the chill of early morning and the creak of doors in still houses. And sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, we hear it whisper back. You stepped outside and looked at the village, washed clean in the first sun. The sky held no threat. The wind was still. The bell rope swayed gently from the tower. Somewhere, a child laughed. And for the first time in a long while, you let yourself believe, maybe this time, the silence will be kind. So much of what they built is still with us. Not because they had more, but because they needed less. They listened to the earth, worked with the weather, and understood that strength doesn't always come from force. Sometimes, it comes from quiet precision. Maybe that's why these walls still stand, and why we're still drawn to them, centuries later. Thank you for drifting through history with me tonight. If your eyes are getting heavy, let them close. The past will hold its place. And if you're still awake, know you're not alone. This channel will be here, always quiet, always waiting. Now stay with the sound for a little while. Let the embers crackle, the beams settle, and time gently fade. Good night.